To demonstrate inheritance, we're going to use the classic object-oriented example of the person class. The person class is defined on line 3 using the keyword class. The name of the class, in this case person. The body of the class, the code that defines the class, is enclosed in braces, beginning on line 4 and closed on line 30. Everything between those braces belongs to the class person. On line 5 and 6, we define two attributes of the class. They are both adorned with the private keyword, meaning that they cannot be accessed by any code outside of the code defined in the person class. On line 8, we've defined a construct method. This is the constructor for the person class. When our application creates an object of type person, this is the function that will be called to create that object. And this function takes two arguments, person's name and ID. Notice that on line 8, the construct function has no access specifier. By default, if no access specifier is included in a function definition, the function is public. Again, by default, a function is public if no access specifier is provided, which is okay for our construct method. We want it to be public. Notice inside of the function block for our construct method, on line 10, we're calling a function string to lower, str to lower. This function simply takes the value of the argument person's name, converts all of the characters to lowercase, and returns that value, which we assign to the private attribute name using the this variable and the arrow operator to access that attribute. Again, pay particular attention to this syntax for accessing attributes within a class. Then we take the ID argument and assign its value to the national ID attribute. On line 13, we have a public function getName that simply returns the value of the name attribute. On line 17, we've defined a function setName that takes an argument newName. The function is adorned with the protected access specifier. The protected access specifier tells the PHP preprocessor that the subclass has access to this method, otherwise the method is private. And in this method, we convert the argument newName to uppercase using the str to upper function and assign that value to the name attribute. On line 21, we define a function setNationalID that accepts an argument called ID. Notice the adornment on this function. On line 21, final and private. Private meaning that this is inaccessible to any code outside of the class. Final tells the PHP preprocessor that this function cannot be overridden by a subclass. And there is no code associated with this function because it's our design decision that once the national ID is set, when a person object is created, it should not be allowed to be changed. On line 26, we have a public function that returns the value of national ID. GetNationalID simply returns the attribute value. Now, to make use of this person base class, we've created a class employee that will inherit from the person class. On line 32, class employee extends the person class. It's going to inherit all of the data, all of the functions of the person class, and those that are protected or public, it will have direct access to within the employee class. Anything that's marked private in the person class, the employee class will not be able to access those functions or attributes. The only way the code within employee can access the private attributes or functions of the person class is to call the functions that provide the interface to those private attributes. So the definition of the employee class includes two private attributes, employee ID and department. Then we have our constructor on line 37. The construct method, again, with no adornment for access specification, which means by default it will be public. The construct method takes three arguments: employee name, national ID, and department. When our code creates an employee object, part of that creation of the employee will be to create a person object as part of the employee object. So our code needs the arguments necessary to create the person object. In this case, employee name and national ID. So on line 39, we call the constructor, the construct function for the parent class person. Notice the syntax: parent : and the name of the function. This tells the PHP preprocessor, go to my parent class and call this function. In this case, we're calling the construct function, and we're passing the arguments necessary to build a person object. On line 40, we assign the return value from a function call to generate employee ID, which is a function that belongs to the employee class, because we're calling it with the this variable and the arrow operator, and it returns a unique employee ID which we assign to our attribute employee ID. We take the department argument and assign it to the department attribute. On line 43, we've defined an accessor function, setName, a public access function, setName. Now notice that setName is the same function as what we've defined on line 17 in the parent class. So the setName function in the employee class on line 43 is an override of the function in the parent class. In our case, we're simply calling the parent version of setName within the override in the employee class. On line 47, we've declared another final private function called setEmployeeID. Again, final tells the PHP preprocessor that this function cannot be overridden. Private tells the PHP preprocessor that no code outside of the employee class can access this function. And again, our design decision is that once an employee ID is assigned, it cannot be changed. We have no code implementing this function. On line 52, we have a public function to access the attribute employee ID. On line 56, public function to access the department attribute. On line 60, another access function to the department attribute. And on line 64, we have a little helper function for our employee class. This function is final and private and generates an employee ID. Again, final telling the PHP preprocessor that this function cannot be overridden in a subclass. Private telling the PHP preprocessor that this function is only accessible from within this class. On line 66, we declare a variable as static. What this tells the PHP preprocessor is that there is but one IDGen variable for however many objects of type employee we create in our application. There will always ever only be one variable IDGen. It is shared among all of the objects of type employee. And then we increment that value and return it to the caller. To create objects of these types within our application, we use the new keyword. On line 9, I've included the file that defines the classes. Then on line 11, I create a person type object and pass it the values for the arguments that its constructor requires, a name and a national ID. The return from the construction of the person object, the handle to that person object, is stored in the MacReady variable. Then we do a var dump on that variable. Then we create on line 14 an employee object. Now, the employee object requires 3 arguments in its constructor, 2 of which are passed directly to the person class constructor, and the third is used to assign to the department attribute. So on line 14, we create a new employee with 3 arguments passed to the employee constructor. The employee constructor, in turn, passes 2 arguments to the person constructor and then assigns the value for the department, which is the 3rd argument, and assigns a value to the employee ID with a call to the getEmployeeID function, then returns a handle to the newly created employee object, and we store that handle. We assign it to the Roy variable. Then we dump the variable on line 16. On line 17, we create another employee object. When that object is created, its handle is passed back and stored in the Inara variable. And on line 19, we dump that variable. So let's see how this runs. Reload the page, and we'll notice that object 1, the first var dump, is of person type, and we get a list of the attributes of the person type along with their access specifier. So we see that the attribute is name from the person class, and it is a private access specifier. Its value is RJ MacReady, and it is of type string and size 13. The only other attribute of the person class, the national ID, also private, is an integer whose value is 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we dump the 2 employee objects. Employee ID is a private attribute of the employee class of type integer whose value is 1. Now recall that the employee ID is populated using a static variable in the class, which means that that variable only exists once for all instances of the class, and that we increment that value after we return from the call to the function getEmployeeID. So our first employee object has a value of 1. We would expect that our next employee object has a value of 2. And certainly it does. Here is our second employee object. And again, the value of the employee ID attribute is 2.